On the 14th of April, 1902, a young man opened a shop in a coal town in western Wyoming. By the time he locked the door that night, the register held $33.41. I have read that figure in a few places over the years, and it never looks like the beginning of anything. The man was 26 years old. He had come west because a doctor told him his lungs were failing. Miners bought their work shirts and their cloth from him, and he could not afford most of what sat on his own shelves. He had borrowed the money simply to be there. His name was James Cash Penney. That single room in Kemmerer became the first store in a chain that would eventually reach every state in the country. It would employ tens of thousands of people and carry his name over shopping centers from one coast to the other. For most of the 20th century, it was the kind of place an American family assumed would always be there. Then, almost exactly 118 years later, it filed for bankruptcy and began to close. This is the story of the man in that first store. It is about a fortune built on one idea and then lost in a single autumn, when he was 56 years old and owed millions he did not have. It is about the night he checked himself into a sanitarium, certain his life was finished, and the thing he heard there that turned him around. It is also, oddly, about a young clerk he once stopped to teach in an Iowa store. That clerk was Sam Walton, and the company he built would help bury the one Penney gave his life to. A preacher's son from Missouri, made to pay for his own shoes at the age of 8. A man who handed his employees a share of everything he owned. A man who lost all of it and started over in his late 50s, and lived to 95. To understand how any of that happened, you have to go back to the coal town, and to a boy who was told he was dying. Chapter 1. The register read $33. Kemmerer was barely 5 years old when Penney arrived. Coal had been found in the ground there in 1897, and a town went up around the mines almost overnight. By 1902, it held about 1,000 people. Most of them worked underground, or were married to a man who did. A rail line ran straight through it, hauling coal out and carrying supplies in. The families along that line needed work clothes and dry goods. What they mostly could not find was an honest price. Retail in those days ran on credit and negotiation. A merchant would size up a customer and set the price to fit whatever he guessed they could pay. The mining company kept its own store, and it handed out credit freely, which quietly bound its workers in debt to the very people who employed them. That was the arrangement Penney stepped into. For a mining family, the company store was less a convenience than a trap. Wages went out one door and came back through another, and a man could work a full season only to end it owing more than he had earned. Everyone understood the arithmetic. Almost no one could climb out of it. He arrived as a junior partner, not an owner. Two older merchants, Guy Johnson and Thomas Callahan, ran a small string of shops under the name Golden Rule, and Penney had clerked for them long enough to win their trust. When they decided to open one more store, he argued for a town too small to tempt anyone else, somewhere he could come to know every customer by name. The stake for his 1/3 share was $2,000, and most of it was borrowed, some of it from his wife's father. It was more money than he had ever held. If the store failed, he would be finished before he had truly started. The building was a single room, its shelving knocked together from shipping crates. Penney and his young wife lived in the attic above it, carrying water up the stairs and warming it on a stove. Their whole life fit into the space over the shop. Before he opened, he walked the length of the town on foot, taking stock of what the place actually lacked. Then he set out his goods and made a promise Kemmerer had never quite been offered. Every item wore a single price, marked in plain sight, the same for everyone who came through the door. No haggling, no credit. If you had the cash, you paid what the tag said, and if you did not, you came back when you could. What strikes me about that first store is not what it sold, but what it refused to do. It refused to guess what a person was worth. The miner's wife paid the same as the mine boss. In a town running on debt, that was nearly a revolution. The established merchants warned him he would fold. Cash only, they said, would send shoppers straight to the stores that let them buy now and pay later. They had it backwards. Those families had been ground down by credit for years, and a shop that treated them like everyone else was worth the walk across town. He worked the way a man works when his own money is on the line. The days ran long, opening before dawn and ending well after dark. He stocked the shelves himself and stood behind his own counter, learning faces and names. His rule was simple. He sold decent goods at a small markup and moved them quickly rather than wait on fine merchandise for a wealthy buyer who might never come. Volume, not margin, was the whole idea. In its first full year, that one room took in more than $28,000 and cleared $8,000 in profit. For a single shop in a distant coal camp, the figures were hard to argue with. Word traveled the way it does in small places, from one kitchen to the next. The store that would not cheat you became a point of quiet local pride. Penney did not mark the moment by easing off. He poured the profit back in and went looking for the next town. Rock Springs came first, and then Cumberland, both of them coal camps strung along the same railroad. He copied the formula exactly. Small towns kept the rent low. He spent nothing on fixtures and stocked only what plain families actually needed. By 1907, 5 years on, he had earned enough and proven enough to buy Johnson and Callahan out completely. The Golden Rule stores belonged to him now. There were 3 of them, all in Wyoming, all built on the same stubborn promise. At 31, he owned a small chain and a method he trusted. What he did not yet own was a name over the door that a stranger would recognize. That part would come. For the moment, he was a shopkeeper in a mining town, working his own register and sleeping above his own shelves, quietly certain that the way he did business was the way it ought to be done everywhere. Chapter 2. The Boy Who Was Told He Was Dying. James Cash Penney was named for his father, a Missouri farmer who preached on Sundays without pay, and ran his household as though comfort itself were a kind of temptation. The family worked a farm outside Hamilton, in the northwest corner of the state. James was the 7th of 12 children, and one of only 6 who lived to grow up. His father belonged to a strict Baptist sect, and believed a boy learned the worth of $1 by being made to earn it. So when James turned 8, he was told he would be buying his own clothes from then on. The lesson was not cruelty. It was doctrine. A penny did not lean on anyone he did not have to. The boy did not argue. He raised pigs and traded horses, earning what he needed one sale at a time. It was a hard lesson for a child, and it took hold. For the rest of his life, he would treat money as something to be respected, never something to be assumed. He was a good student, and he wanted to be a lawyer. But there was no money for college, and after he finished high school in 1893, he went back to the fields. For 2 years he farmed and waited and wondered what would become of him. Then his father made one last arrangement on his behalf. He asked a merchant in town to take the boy on and teach him the dry goods trade. James started behind the counter early in 1895. Weeks later, his father died. By the account that came down through the family, the old man said near the end that Jim would make something of himself. He did not live to find out whether he was right. James was 19, and the man whose approval he had spent his childhood chasing was gone. The store suited James in a way the farm never had. He was shy at first, and the older clerks outsold him with ease. But he studied the work the way he studied everything. Within a year or 2, he was outselling every other clerk behind that counter. Selling, he had decided, was not something a man was born knowing. It was a craft, and he meant to master it. Then his body turned on him. A doctor found the early signs of tuberculosis in his lungs and warned him, in the blunt manner of the day, that if he stayed in the Missouri damp he would not last long. He needed dry air and high ground. What he needed was the West. There is an irony here I have never quite gotten over. The illness that was meant to end him is the only reason the rest of it ever happened. In the summer of 1897, at 21, Penney left Missouri for Colorado. He arrived with almost nothing, and at first the West nearly finished what the disease had started. His small savings went into a butcher shop, and the butcher shop failed. He had come west to save his life, and nearly buried himself in a failed meat market instead. What pulled him back was a clerking job at a small dry goods store nearby, one of a little chain called the Golden Rule. The name would have rung familiar. It was the same principle his father had preached from a country pulpit, now lettered over a shop door and applied to the selling of work boots and calico. The two men who owned those stores, Guy Johnson and Thomas Callahan, saw what his first employer had seen back in Hamilton. Here was a clerk who worked harder than the job asked and treated every customer alike. In 1899, they handed him their store in Evanston, Wyoming, to manage at $50 a month and a share of the profits. That same year, he married. Berta Alva Hess was a young woman he had met in Colorado, and they were wed in Cheyenne in the late summer of 1899. He was 23, suddenly answerable for a store and a wife, and at last, after all the false starts, standing on solid ground. Evanston went well under him. Sales rose, and the two owners took note of the young manager who could make a small store pay its way. Before long, they would put something larger in front of him, a store he could own a true share of, in a town of his own choosing. You already know the town he chose. Chapter 3. The Man with 1,000 Partners. Most men who build a chain of stores hire managers to run them. Penney turned his managers into owners instead. The idea had been done to him first. Johnson and Callahan had made him a partner in Kemmerer rather than a hired hand, and it changed everything about how hard he was willing to work. He never forgot the difference, so as he opened new stores, he ran it in reverse. A manager who proved himself was not simply promoted. He was given a 1/3 stake in the next store and a share of whatever that store earned. If I had to point to the single decision that built the whole company, it would be this one. The arithmetic of it was almost too clever. A man who owned part of his store worked it like an owner because he was one, and a manager who trained a promising clerk had every reason to train him well. When that clerk was ready to run a store of his own, the man who had taught him took a share of that one too. Good managers made more good managers, and each new one opened another door with the name Golden Rule above it. The chain grew itself. Penney did not call these men employees. He called them associates, and he meant the word. What he wanted were partners who would work as hard as he did and hold themselves to the same standards he kept. He never bonded them against theft, or made them post a surety in case they robbed him. His faith went into them instead, and it was almost always returned. It made for an unusual kind of company. A penny store in a Nebraska farm town was run by a man who owned a piece of it, answerable in the end to no floor walker and no distant board, only to the standard he had agreed to when he signed on. It was a national chain that still felt, store by store, like a local business with a local owner. In 1913, he brought the stores under a single name at last, the J.C. Penney Company, and wrote down the principles it would live by. There were 7 in all. Most were what you might expect, about serving the customer and packing real value into every dollar. But the core of it was a pledge to reward the people who did the work. And every policy faced one last test before it was adopted. Was it fair, and was it honest? If the answer was no, the idea went no further. The following year he moved the head office to New York, closer to the markets and the makers of what his stores sold. By then the stores had spread far past the coal country where he began, into farm towns and county seats across the middle of the country. There had been 34 stores in 1912. Within 15 years there would be more than 1,000 of them. But the years that built all of this were not gentle with him at home. In the winter of 1910, his wife Berta went into a hospital in Salt Lake City for what was meant to be a minor operation. She caught pneumonia there. 2 days after Christmas, still in her 30s, she was gone. The suddenness of it was the hardest part. She had gone in for something small, and she did not come home. Penney was left with 2 small sons and a grief he had no idea what to do with. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He worked. The endless business of opening new stores filled the space she had left, and the partners who leaned on him gave his days a shape. There is a hard truth buried in the record here. The empire of 1,000 partners grew fastest in the very years after he lost the one partner he had wanted to keep. The newspapers would hand him that title in time, the man with 1,000 partners, and by the 1920s it was nearly the literal truth. Hundreds of his managers held real ownership in the stores they ran. 50,000 people would in time draw a share of the company's profits. Few businesses in the country had ever been built on quite that principle. Through those same years, Penney drew back by degrees. In 1917, at 42, he set down the title of president and became chairman of the board. The daily running of the company passed to a steady, gifted man named Earl Sams, who had come up through the ranks and knew the business as thoroughly as Penney did. By the middle of the 1920s, the company more or less ran itself. Sams minded the stores. The partners minded their towns. And Penney, still short of 50, and wealthier than he had ever dreamed a preacher's son might be, found himself with time on his hands. He began to wonder what else a fortune like his might be for. Chapter 4. The Kingdom. No one remembers. The answer, when it came, was not a yacht or a racing stable. It was 120,000 acres of raw pine and scrub in northern Florida. In 1922, Penney and a partner named Ralph Gwynn bought up an enormous tract of cheap land in Clay County, west of the St. Johns River. Florida in those years was gripped by a land mania, fortunes made and lost on paper in a single afternoon. The men buying land were mostly speculators, holding it to sell as the boom drove prices higher. That was never his intention. He meant to build something on it. This was his answer to the question of what a fortune was for. Not to be spent, but to be planted. What he built was a farming community, and he ran it on the same idea that had built his stores. Instead of renting the land to tenants, he let farmers work it and earn a stake in what they grew, the way his managers earned a stake in their stores. He called it Penny Farms. Experts cleared the ground and laid out demonstration plots to prove what the soil could do: citrus and pecans, grapes and winter vegetables. He set up an institute of applied agriculture on the land, brought in specialists to run it, and opened it to farmers who wanted to learn the newest methods. The whole enterprise was a kind of argument made in soil and buildings. Give people a fair start, he seemed to be saying, and they will rise to meet it. It was the golden rule again, worked out this time across 100,000 acres. By 1927, the place had become something close to a small country. 20,000 acres had been cleared, and 300 buildings stood where the pine had been. It grew much of its own food and canned the surplus in its own factory. There was a general store and a post office, a machine shop and a boarding house. 3,000 head of cattle grazed the flatlands. But the piece of it he cared about most was not for farmers at all. In 1926 he built a small community inside the larger one, a ring of cottages around a stone chapel, raised in memory of his mother and father. He called it the Memorial Home Community, and he meant it for old ministers and missionaries who had given their lives to the church and had almost nothing to show for it. A group of students came down from a college in Kentucky and built the chapel with their own hands. I cannot read about that place without thinking of his father. The Reverend Penney had preached for no pay and died with little. And here was his son, building rent-free homes for exactly the kind of worn-out country preacher the old man had been. The cottages went up in a soft French Norman style, and retired clergy lived in them for next to nothing, tending their gardens in the Florida sun. In time, hundreds of them would spend their last years there. To live at Penny Farms, a family had to pass a test that had nothing to do with money. They had to be sober and hard-working, and to arrive with references to their character. Drinking and tobacco were not allowed. It was, in its way, his father's household rebuilt at the scale of a town. The Florida kingdom was only half of it. In the hills of New York, Penney kept a farm called Emmeline, where he bred Guernsey cattle with the same seriousness he brought to everything. Judges knew his animals by name. A penny Guernsey was a mark of quality in the show ring, and buyers paid for it. He gave some of his finest animals away, donating prize stock to agricultural colleges to strengthen the breed. The dairy business he built around the herd, foremost, would grow into a major corporation in its own right. By now, Penney was worth something like $40 million, a fortune in the 1920s. He kept a winter home on the water in Miami, and he was giving money away in a dozen directions, backing a Christian magazine, helping to found a university. But he drew a line in his own mind between the money and himself. It was a tool for building, and not much more. His private life had gone on in the shadow of all the work. He had married again in 1919, a woman named Mary Kimball, and lost her too within a few years. In 1926 he married Caroline, who would stay beside him through everything that was coming. By 1928 the kingdom was as complete as it would ever be. The town of Penney Farms had its own charter. The cottages were full of old preachers, and the cattle were winning ribbons. All of it. Every cleared acre and every prize cow rested on two things: his own fortune and his willingness to borrow against it. He had built a world on the belief that the good years would keep on coming. There was a little more than a year left. Chapter 5. Everything Gone. When the crash came, the company Penney had built barely felt it. The man who built it lost everything he owned. The stores were made for hard times, though he had not planned it that way. They took only cash, so no customer default could touch them. They carried no debt, so no bank could call one in. They sold cheap, useful goods that people still needed when money ran short. While bigger names folded, the chain with the Golden Rule name kept opening stores straight through the worst of it, passing 1,400 by the middle of the 1930s. That was its own kind of cruelty. The thing he had made was thriving. His name stood over 1,000 doors. The idea he had bet his life on was proving itself in exactly the crisis it was built for, and none of it belonged to him any longer in any way that could save him. He could only watch the company sail through the storm and go down beside it. Penney himself was another matter. To pay for the Florida land and everything he had built around it, he had borrowed heavily against his own stock in the company. Millions of dollars of it. As long as the stock held its value, the loans were safe. Then the stock did not hold. It is fair to ask how a man so careful with a company could be so reckless with himself. The answer is that the stock had only ever moved one way. For 20 years it had climbed. Each time he borrowed against it to build another good thing, the rising value covered the debt and left him richer than before. Borrowing had never once cost him anything. He had simply never pictured a year in which it would. In the autumn of 1929, the market broke. Penny stock, which the company had only just sold to the public that year, fell from more than $100 a share to about $13. The banks that had lent him money against those shares wanted it back, and the shares were no longer worth enough to cover the loans. His Florida land, bought in a boom that had already collapsed, was worth a fraction of what he had paid. Everything he owned was tied to values that were disappearing by the day. There was a bitter joke buried in it. For 30 years Penney had preached the same sermon to America. Pay cash and owe no man anything you could not cover. His stores lived by that rule, and it was saving them now. But the man himself had done the opposite. He had mortgaged his life's work to the hilt, and the very debt he had always warned against was about to swallow everything he had. For a man like Penney, the shame of it may have cut deeper than the loss. He had built his whole name on being the man who paid what he owed, who could be trusted, who did right by people. Now he owed money he could not repay to banks that had stopped trusting him. The Golden Rule man had become, in the plainest terms, a debtor. What followed was not a single blow, but a slow bleeding out. Month after month through 1930 and into the year after, he sat across from bankers and sold off pieces of his life to satisfy them. There was no single terrible day, no dramatic ruin. Just the steady subtraction of everything he had spent 30 years building. The detail I keep coming back to is what became of Penney Farms. The whole idealistic experiment had to be broken up and sold off. He let the land go until only a couple hundred acres remained, and those he deeded to the community of retired ministers, so the old preachers at least could keep their homes. The thing he had built to outlast him was dismantled inside a year. The rest went the same way. The winter home in Miami was sold. His stake in the dairy slipped out of his hands. One by one he let the household servants go, unable to pay them any longer. Even his life insurance was borrowed against to cover what he owed. He had given fortunes away to good causes, and now he could not pay the woman who cleaned his house. By the time the fall was complete, a man of 56 who had once been worth $40 million owed $7 million he did not have. That much could be counted. The rest could not. The sleeplessness came first, and then a worry that would not switch off. Beneath both was something deeper he could not name. The losses themselves he might have survived. What they were doing to him was another matter. Somewhere in those months, the man his family had leaned on for everything began to give way. Chapter 6. The Hymn in the Corridor. Some exhaustion goes deeper than the body, into a place sleep cannot reach. By the early 1930s, that was where Penney lived. The losses had not killed him. What came after nearly did. He could not sleep. The worry ran in circles through the night and left him hollow by morning, and no amount of rest gave anything back. His health gave way along with everything else. A man who had worked long days for most of his life could suddenly barely rise from a chair, and the doctors could not mend what was wrong, because the wound was not really in his body. For a man whose whole life had been built on strength and self-reliance, the helplessness was its own torment. He had been raised never to lean on anyone. Now he could not get through a single day on his own. Where he ended up was a place called the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan. It was a famous health resort, run by a doctor named John Harvey Kellogg, the same Kellogg whose brother had turned the family name into a breakfast cereal. The sanitarium was a world unto itself, part hospital and part hotel. Guests took cold baths and ate the doctor's famously bland vegetarian meals. Presidents and tycoons had passed through its doors over the years. Penney barely noticed any of it. He had come because a friend had all but carried him through the door, and because he had nowhere else to go. He arrived a ruined man in every sense of the word. Somewhere along the way he had convinced himself that the collapse was his fault alone, that he had failed every person who ever trusted him. One night, believing he would not see the morning, he sat down and wrote farewell letters to his wife and his sons. He was the man who had built an empire of 1,000 partners, and he sat in the dark, writing goodbye. By his own account, he did not expect to leave that place alive, and a part of him no longer wished to. It was in that state, one morning before dawn, that he could not stay in his bed a moment longer. He got up and walked the dark corridors of the sanitarium with no destination in mind. Somewhere in the building ahead of him, he heard singing. A small chapel service had begun down the hall. The voices were carrying a hymn he had known since he was a boy, one from the country churches of his Missouri childhood. It was called, "God Will Take Care of You." He stopped where he stood. He had not heard it in years, and the sound of it in that place at that hour undid something in him. I will not pretend to know what happened in that chapel. What it did to the rest of his life is not in doubt. He stepped inside and took a seat at the back, among strangers who did not know him and did not care what he had lost. He let the singing move through him. For the length of that hymn, the crushing arithmetic of his debts fell silent. In its place came something he had not felt since boyhood, the sense that he was not carrying all of it alone. He would describe it ever after as the morning he was born again. Nothing about his circumstances had changed. He was still ruined and in debt, a man of 56 with a mountain in front of him. But something inside him had shifted. In the days that followed, the change was small but real. He began to eat again, and to sleep a little. The despair that had nearly finished him loosened its grip enough that he could draw a full breath. He did not become a new man overnight. The deeper commitments of faith, the church membership and the rest, would come slowly across the years ahead. But the turn itself was made that morning. He had decided, almost without deciding, to live. Everything Penney did across the next 40 years traced back to that morning in the corridor. He had 40 years left to live, and the fortune he would rebuild and the peace he would carry into old age both began with a broken man following the sound of a hymn. The man who walked into that sanitarium no longer wanted to be alive. The man who walked out had found the one thing the crash had stripped from him, and the hymn had somehow handed back. A reason to begin again. Chapter 7. The Man Who Would Not Retire. He came out of Battle Creek still deep in debt, and he set about the long business of climbing out. It took most of a decade. The company he had built kept thriving through the Depression, and as it did, the value of the stock he had managed to hold on to began to climb back. He set to paying down what he owed, one piece at a time, the way he had earned everything since he was a boy. There was no shortcut, and he did not look for one. By the second half of the 1930s, the debt was gone, and much of the fortune was back. He was a wealthy man again, though he never again spoke of money as if it were the point. It went where it had always gone, into other people. He set up a foundation to organize his giving, and went on backing churches and schools, helping young men trying to make their way as he once had. And the faith that had found him in that corridor deepened into the center of his life. He was baptized at last in 1942, and formally joined a church in 1950. The turn made before dawn in Michigan had become, across 20 years, the settled ground he stood on. Through all of it, the ruin and the recovery both, there had been Caroline. He had married her in 1926, before the fall, and unlike the two wives he had lost, she stayed. They had 2 daughters, and the house he kept in his last decades was a warmer place than the one grief had once emptied. After a life shadowed by loss, he had, at last, a marriage that lasted. In 1946, at 70, he gave up the chairmanship. He did not, in any sense that mattered, retire. An office was kept for him, and he came to it. He went on visiting the stores, greeting associates by name and straightening the shelves with his own hands. He was said to know the freight rates and the price of cotton the way other old men knew baseball scores. Retirement to him seemed less a reward than a slow way of stepping out of the world, and he wanted no part of it. He lived simply for a man of his means. He rose early and worked a full day. Letters came from ordinary people asking his advice, and he answered them all, treating a store clerk and a senator with the same courtesy. Presidents wrote to him. Business schools studied him. He had become the living proof of his own creed, the man who did well by doing right, and the country loved him for it. In 1951, at 75, he went back to the very first store in Kemmerer, and worked behind the counter for a day, selling shirts to the grandchildren of miners. The thing I find most moving is that he did not have to do any of it. He was old now, wealthy and admired, free to rest anywhere he pleased. Instead, he chose the store floor, again and again, because the work itself was what he loved. He had come out the far side of ruin with something that wealth rarely brings. He seemed, by every account, genuinely at peace. He wrote books in these years, passing along what he had learned to anyone who cared to read it. On his 86th birthday, someone caught him in a photograph, pointing at a picture of that first Kemmerer store, grinning like a man who could not quite believe his own luck. If you had asked what he had learned in all those years, he might have said that nothing important had changed since he was a boy. The rules he had carried out of that Missouri farmhouse and nearly lost in the crash had held after all. He died on the 12th of February, 1971, in New York, at the age of 95. His friend Norman Vincent Peale, the preacher, spoke at the funeral. He had lived through more change than almost any man alive. Born into a world of horses and coal towns, he died in the age of jet planes and suburban malls, his own name hanging over hundreds of them. By then, the company stood as the 5th largest retailer in the country, past 1,600 stores. The boy who once could not afford his own shoes had built a name known in every corner of America. He had lost it, and won it back. And he died a contented old man. He died believing the company he had built would go on forever. For a while it looked as though he was right. Chapter 8. the clerk who would eclipse him. An old man once showed a young clerk how to wrap a package using as little paper and string as possible and still make it look neat. It happened in a penny store in downtown Des Moines, Iowa, in the summer of 1940. The old man was James Cash Penney, in his 60s by then, still turning up unannounced to walk the floors of his stores. The clerk was 22 years old and 3 days out of college, newly hired that same week as a management trainee for about $75 a month. He was ambitious in a restless, watchful way, the sort who studied everyone above him for whatever he could use. His name was Sam Walton. It sounds like a legend, the kind of too-neat story that attaches itself to famous men. I checked. It is true. Walton wrote about it himself years later, remembering the founder's small lesson in thrift. He was already the kind of young man who noticed such things, who saw that a great business could be built out of countless small savings. A length of string here, a reused box there. None of them worth much alone, and all of them together worth a fortune. There is something telling in the picture. The founder of a national chain, a man who had made and lost more money than the boy would see for decades, taking the time to teach a raw recruit how not to waste a few inches of twine. To Penney, it was not a small thing at all. It was the whole philosophy in miniature. Walton stayed at Penney's for about 18 months before the war took him. It was not long, but it left a mark. He absorbed the 7-point creed the company ran on, the Penney idea, and carried pieces of it for the rest of his life. The people who worked in Walton's stores would one day be called associates, the same word Penney had used, whether by inheritance or by coincidence. The war came, and then the peace, and Walton went into business for himself. He opened a variety store in a small Arkansas town, and then another, learning as he went. In 1962, in Rogers, Arkansas, he built the first store of a new kind. The idea was simple and hard-edged. Buy in enormous quantity and keep costs brutally low. Pass the savings to the customer and make it back in sheer volume. He called it Walmart. What Walton built did not stay small. Walmart became the largest retailer in the world, and by revenue the largest company of any kind. The family he left it to became the wealthiest in America, worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The little store in Rogers had grown into something on a scale that Penney, for all his 1,000 partners, never dreamed of. There is a strange lineage in it. The things that made Walmart were not so far from what had made Penney. The same thrift, the same faith that you served people best by charging them less. Walton had taken the older man's instincts and pushed them further than Penney would ever have gone, into a machine of enormous scale and rock-bottom cost. It was Penney's golden rule, stripped of its Sunday clothes and run at industrial speed. But the world Walton built was not kind to the world Penney had built. The discount giants changed what Americans expected of a store, and the mid-market chains, the ones that had held down Main Street for half a century, slowly lost their footing. Penney's company would be among them. It was never Walmart alone that brought it down, far from it. But the ground had shifted, and it had shifted in the direction Sam Walton pushed it. The fair price that once seemed radical in a Wyoming coal town was now simply the price, and someone was always willing to go lower. Penney never saw the size of it. When he died in 1971, Walmart was a few dozen stores scattered across the South, its stock only lately trading. To anyone watching, it would have looked like a minor regional upstart, no threat to a giant like Penney's. He went to his grave believing his company would last forever, never knowing that the polite young clerk he had taught to save a length of string was building the thing that would help take it apart. Chapter 9. The Empire After the Man. In the end, it was not hard times that finished the company. Hard times it had always survived. What finished it was a long run of its own mistakes, and one truly disastrous idea. The company kept growing after Penney was gone. It reached its greatest size in 1973, with 2,053 stores. It was the 5th largest retailer in the country, and an anchor of the American shopping mall. The place a middle-class family went for its school clothes and its Christmas portraits. For a while it seemed as fixed a part of American life as the flag. Then the long tide began to go out. It went out slowly, over decades, and for years it was easy to miss. The discount stores that Sam Walton had helped unleash took the budget shoppers first. Then came online shopping, and the slow death of the shopping mall, on which Penney's had staked nearly everything. By 2006, the company was selling around $20 billion a year. Within a decade and a half, that number had roughly halved. The company knew it was in trouble, and in 2011, it reached for a savior. A hedge fund manager named Bill Ackman had taken a large stake and pushed hard for change. The board brought in a man with a golden reputation, an executive named Ron Johnson, who had built the dazzling retail stores of Apple. He arrived promising to reinvent Penney's from the ground up. What he did in 2012 was bet the whole company on a single idea. He swept away the endless coupons and sales that Penney's shoppers had come to love, and put in their place everyday low prices, simple and clear, no games. He remade the brand from the logo outward and rebuilt the look of the stores, and he did it all without once testing whether the customers wanted any of it. Here is the irony I keep snagging on. Everyday low prices, no haggling, and no gimmicks. It was almost exactly the idea James Cash Penney had opened his first store on 110 years before. The founder's own principle, brought back from the dead. But Penney's customers were not frontier miners anymore. They had been trained for decades to hunt for coupons and to chase the thrill of a sale. And when the sales were gone, they felt cheated and they left. The result was catastrophic. In a single year, the company's sales fell by a quarter. $4.3 billion simply gone. Johnson was out within 17 months, but the damage held. The company that had survived the Great Depression could not survive its own reinvention. It never recovered. Johnson's replacement brought back the sales, but the customers did not fully return with them. The company cycled through chief executives and strategies, and none of them worked. It lost money almost every year, its sales sliding, and underneath it all sat close to $5 billion in debt, most of it a legacy of the failed reinvention. The end, when it came quickly. In early 2020, the coronavirus pandemic shut the doors of nearly every store in the country. For a company already this weak, it was the final blow. That May, after 118 years in business, J.C. Penney filed for bankruptcy. It was taken off the New York Stock Exchange after 91 years. The store count, more than 2,000 at the peak, had fallen to 846. More than 200 of those stores closed for good. What remained was bought out of bankruptcy by two of the country's largest mall landlords for around $800 million. They did not buy it because they believed in the future of the department store. They bought it because an empty anchor store kills a mall, and they needed the space filled. The company survived, after a fashion. But it survived as a tenant kept breathing by its landlords, a shadow of the thing Penney built. And there is one last detail, the one that closes the circle. On the list of stores to be auctioned off in the bankruptcy sat a small store in Kemmerer, Wyoming. It was the mother store, the original, the single room that had opened on the 14th of April, 1902. It had not once closed its doors in all the years since. The first store, where it had all begun, was now a line on an auction sheet. It had been 118 years since a sick young man rang up $33 in that room and let himself believe he could build something that would last. He had been right, and then he had been wrong, and now the proof of both was up for sale. He did not fall once, but twice. The crash took his fortune. The breakdown that followed nearly took him. Both times he found his way back. By the time he died, he had already learned the thing most people spend a lifetime avoiding. He knew from the inside the difference between a fortune and a life. He had lost the first and kept the second, and he never confused the two again. What Penney really left is harder to put in a display case. It is a way of doing business that assumed the person across the counter was your equal, and a stubborn belief that you could be decent and successful at the same time. In an age that often treats that idea as naive, his life stands as a living argument that it is not. Out in Wyoming, the first store still stands too, a small brick building the country marked as worth keeping. People stopped to see where it all began. The register that once read $33 is long silent. The idea behind it is not. The empire he built to last did not. The kindness he built almost as an afterthought did. Somewhere in Penney Farms tonight, an old minister is being looked after in a cottage a merchant paid for a century ago, and does not know his name. That, in the end, is the monument that mattered.